Greetings, my friends. So nice to see you around the hearth once more. Who shall etch their name in the game's eternal lore? Gather round the fire, for there's a new tale to be told. The Hearthstone Championship Tour continues. It's go time! This is the Asia-Pacific Summer Playoffs!
Today, in day 2 of the Asia-Pacific Summer Playoffs, many have already been eliminated and the pressure builds with every match. Nudge yourself closer to the fire, my friends. The Asia-Pacific Summer Playoffs march on.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the HCT Asia-Pacific Summer Playoffs. I'm TJ. Joining me on the analyst desk to start the show is Raven Sottle and, of course, J. Billy B. Guys, day 1 was pretty blazingly fast for 6 rounds of Swiss, if you ask me. How'd it feel for you, Raven?
Yeah, same. I think it went really quick. I think a lot of the aggressive decks, which were most of the actual tournament field, went relatively fast. But there were a couple of decks that really stood out, you know, the Shaman. And the big question I think we've all got is just Odd Rogue. Pass.
Set up for Sottle to talk about his favorite deck. Sottle, how was day 1 for you?
It was awesome. I definitely agree. It went by a little faster than I was expecting. The aggro was definitely pushing its way through. There was only a few really targeted anti-aggro heavy control lineups in the field, and the aggro decks seemed like they were able to get through them. We've got a lot of even Shamans near the top of the rankings, a few Odd Rogues as well, despite what we were saying, even though I have close to 0 faith in that deck, but we will see how it pans out for day 2.
And Billy, you got your first day of HCT casting in the books. How was it?
It was real fun. I mean, I'm so excited to have the opportunity to be here, but also just seeing all these unique lineups. I mean, Frosty and Citizen Napa both succeeding with unconventional decks, and 2 of our 3 players that didn't bring even Paladin, StrikeRight and Mega Glysaur, both still live at 4-2.
Yeah, we'll see if we can get a non-even shot. 96% of the field, or sorry, even Paladin, brought even Paladin. But let's go and take a look at the schedule for day number 2 as we get into things. We're going to start things off with the 7th and final round of Swiss. And then we're going to head right into those dual tournament group stages with the top 8 players from that Swiss cut. And of course, we're going to give tickets to our final 4 players for the Summer Championship. And speaking of that, let's go and take a look at the leaderboards and the front runners moving into that. Xiao Dai remains as the only player to have an undefeated record after 1 day of play. But still a lot of relatively big names at 5-1. Citizen Napa, Frosty, as Billy was talking about. Also Tansoku, Control Warrior, control deck player. Love to see that.
Why else do you like to see that, TJ?
No other reason.
Okay, nothing to do with predictions.
Nope.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, definitely a lot of unconventional decks in that leaderboard. Xiao Dai has the Odd Rogue, which we've been having a little bit of smack talk towards, but there's also the Control Warrior in there, as you mentioned. And then, as Billy said, Citizen Napa with that Secret Hunter that he has doing incredibly well as well.
Secret Hunter actually looked really good in the 1 game sample size that we saw of it. He didn't even have that great of an opening, but he had Spellstone.
I mean, I was going to say, he went like secret Spellstone. That's a pretty good opening.
When the deck has 9 secrets, that's likely. I'm saying he didn't have Secret Keeper. He didn't have any of like the early board control tools. He just kind of secret, Spellstone, and then won the game.
Yeah.
But let's take a look at the last undefeated player. We'll talk about him a little bit more in depth. Billy, Xiao Dai, 6-0. We don't know much about him, but tell us what we do know.
Right, we saw him play at the playoffs last year. He was in the winter and the spring playoffs, but we did miss him in the summer. But we do know he's a great ladder grinder with that 16 finish in February, 56 this last March. I mean, Xiao Dai is a player that at 6-0, he's pretty much a lock for the top 8, so we're very likely to see a lot more of him.
Yeah, and of course, being from Taiwan, that seems like a great country for Hearthstone recently. Maybe not for Tom in this portion, since he dropped at 0-3, but our reigning world champion may have inspired some players to get on the grind and start playing some more Hearthstone.
I believe, Tom actually picked up official recognition from his country for his successes in the World Championship. So maybe we're seeing that trickle down, and Taiwan is gonna push on, be a huge force in the game.
That's right. But now that we're done talking about Xiao Dai, we can take a look at some of the other trends from around Asia Pacific and what happened on day number 1. Chinese Taipei in control. 3 players at 5-1 or better. That kind of is a point that we were just talking about is, did Tom inspire a new generation of Hearthstone professional, Raven?
Yes.
Awesome.
No,
Moving on.
I actually think, like, you know, we could see something similar like we've seen from Japan in the last year or so.
Yeah.
Of just a region we just didn't see that many players from, or that many players actually reach later stages of HCT, to suddenly just an explosion in, you know, maybe not popularity, but just performance from that region. We see, you know, TreadsRed, for example, is doing very well. I think this might be the next region on the list for Asia-Pacific.
Yeah, and I just want to talk about one more thing that Saddle kind of mentioned, and Billy, I want to get your thoughts on it. Sort of a story emerging is even Shaman having a lot of success on stream. It looked like it was unbeatable from anything but Priest. What are your thoughts on the deck? And you think we'll see some players in the top 8 that have that in their lineup?
Well, I do think we're starting to see a little bit more even Shaman. I mean, it's not in as many of the 5-1 lineups as I might have thought at the beginning of the day, but it is still at least, I think, in 2 of the lineups that are 5-1 or better right now. And the fact that it is one of the few decks that can kind of bring some game to even Paladin, I think we're gonna see at least one of the top 8.
Yeah, anything? Oh, go ahead, Saddle.
I just think even with only 2 or maybe 3 in those top rankings, it was only represented by 12 players total coming into this. So that's
a good portion.
That's still an incredible hit rate to be pushing towards the top of the rankings.
Yeah, I think as well for me, it's also just a great deck to watch be played, because there's actually many different styles. We saw the whole, you know, just don't play stuff until you draw Hagatha, and then you just destroy Warlock.
As much as that's costing me a dinner, it was fascinating to watch.
It was great.
Yeah. Oh, don't worry. We'll get into that later on in the day. But we do have 2 other fine gentlemen joining us on the broadcast team today. Frodan and That's Admirable. How you guys doing?
Doing great, TJ. Thank you. What a high compliment from TJ, the epitome of class and sophistication.
Ooh.
Being able to drop a nice little compliment there. I mean it, TJ.
Bold call. See if it pays off for you.
Yeah. Perhaps I need to choose my role models a little bit better. But Admirable, we have round number 7 coming up for Swiss to wrap up the the Swiss portion here. There'll be a last round, and after that we find a top 8, and then we'll have the last 4 players going to championships, because we do know we're from Europe and Americas, and then China also has their players for a couple months now. What's going to happen here? I mean, Japan and Taiwan have also been doing really well, but then we've also had expectations for really dominant countries like Korea in the past.
Well, South Korea is one of the countries I think that's been strongly represented just across Hearthstone in general. Look at Kranich, who was the first player to make back-to-back world championships. Surrender has certainly put his mark on the map. South Korea has no shortage of very strong talents out there. Just in this tournament, we're seeing Japan and we're seeing Chinese Taipei players really put their mark out there as they're just dominating the field, quite frankly. And I think it's really cool to see, because I want more of that representation out there. I want to see players build names for themselves in these countries and really push themselves to the top of HCT.
Yep. How do we pick a one to watch when literally all of APAC could be justified as the ones to watch? And with that, let's take a look at the predictions on how we've done so far, which much to the chagrin of, I think, most of us. I think it's safe to say that we got wrecked, guys. Most of us got wrecked. Maybe TJ didn't.
Like
TJ's doing pretty well.
Look, the fields are getting tougher and tougher. There's no question about that. And in order to keep up, you're going to have to be putting in more work than pretty much everyone else. I would say some of the predictions have been a matter of pick the good people, because they brought the good decks and they played really well. But now there's so many players in a field that are earning these prestigious spots that it's more difficult to do that.
Some of us just have incredible foresight into which decks are going to be powerful given the field of decks that we're seeing in the Asia-Pacific playoffs.
See how quickly this goes to your head, TJ? It's not just me.
I mean, to be honest,
been right behind you, Saddle. Let's not blow things out of proportion
Why don't you get
here.
back there where you belong? All right?
I'm very happy with 2nd place. It's about as good as it's going to get for me, to be honest, so I'm good.
We'll just lock it in now.
You're the second. You got 2nd place in your casting duo as well.
Zing!
I do want to say, there's no comeback from that. I do want to say that I agree with you, TJ. I just happen to pick the wrong people who play the same lineup. I was saying Control Warrior, and I do think that anti-Paladin strategy has a lot of weight, and I think we do see it with some of these players like Tonsoku and Suni. And Suni and Kribo have the same exact lineup through and through. So I feel like Kibler in this sentence, where he picked Frozen, but Fibonacci is the one who did really well, even though they have kind of card for card the same lineup.
This is part of what cards go. It's any given Sunday, and you can pretty much win or lose regardless of how well you prepared or how well you've done. It's that consistency over time that really plays out. So
that
picking the right
sounds
lineup
like
still.
the explanation of a guy who's at the bottom of the prediction leaderboards to me.
It's our rationalizations, the only way
true.
that we can not get fired here, TJ. But enough about us and our predictions. One of the predictions is still fighting for his life, and we'll see if Surrender can redeem Raven here with a big win, as round number 7 will feature Surrender versus StrikeRight. And that's going to start right now.
It's the third and final weekend of the 2018 HCT Summer Playoffs, and the arcane missiles are flying in the Asia-Pacific region as we near the end of our quest to find out which 4 players will complete the 16, moving on to the HCT Summer Championship. Early on, we witnessed our reigning world champion, Tom60229, take his first loss against Piobot from Japan. Piobot, the #1 arena rankings holder in December, fell to Tom60229's quest row, giving Tom a decent chance of survival. But things did not go well in the Spiteful Druid versus Cube Warlock match, as Tom was unable to cling to life in the matchup, ultimately ending in concession. This would be one of 3 consecutive match losses for Tom60229, which moved him out of contention for the 2018 HCT Summer Championship. In round 2, we saw a face-off between Kribo and Surrender. Kribo had a favorable hand in game 1, but Surrender showed why he is a world-class player. Surrender's grit paid off despite his poor start, and was able to skillfully edge out a win from an unfavorable scenario in game 1. In game 3, Surrender came out looking to secure the round with his even-cost Paladin deck, but Kribo's Warlock put him in check. The match went the distance, and in game 4, Surrender secured his win with his even-cost Paladin against Kribo's Control Priest. In round 4, B787 took on Doc Malza, starting in a Warlock mirror match. Doc Malza soldiered on to a 2-0 lead using his Cube Warlock and Spiteful Druid. With only Paladin left for Doc Malza, B787 brought it to its knees, ultimately winning the round in an intense 5-game match. Turn by turn, these players are working hard to secure a spot at the 2018 HCT Summer Championship in Los Angeles. Who will get the job done? Find out today as day 2 of the 2018 HCT Asia-Pacific Summer Playoffs begins now.
Nudge yourself closer to the fire, my friends. It's round 7. Let's go!
Round 7 will bring us to a conclusion for the Swiss portion here at the Asia-Pacific Summer Playoffs of the Hearthstone Championship Tour. Up on your screen, we have the bands in for StrikeRight versus Surrender. The winner of this will improve to 5-2 and be in contention for top 8, and at the very least, guarantee themselves a chunk of points. StrikeRight has banned the Quest Rogue, while Surrender has banned the Control Warlock, which is an interesting take because people have been leaving up and open the Warlock. But given that Control Warlock is a lot better against, say, the Spiteful Druid than Cube Warlock is, it's not that surprising that Surrender does not feel as comfortable playing against that deck compared to some of the other decks in StrikeRight's lineup. And now that we look at the head-to-head, who do you think is favored here, Admirable?
Well, I think pretty much any way you slice it, unless something drastic happens, I feel like Surrender's favored in this one. Yeah. His decks are really well built, I think, to tackle the style that StrikeRight has brought, but he does have some spots that can fight back very well. We're starting off with a Priest versus Druid matchup. So for StrikeRight, he's going to be on Control Priest, and Surrender's going to be piloting a Spiteful Druid here. And this is a matchup that has a couple of really big inflection points in the game. The first one for StrikeRight is, does Surrender have one of the early big threat checks with Prince Kaliseth or Vicious Fledgling? And wow, he's got both of them to start with. StrikeRight needs to be able to stifle these turns quite early and then set up for a position where he's able to draw some cards and find the right tools. The second one is the Spiteful Summoner. The big power point that card provides for Surrender is awfully troublesome for StrikeRight. So if he can't contain at least one of those two spots, it's pretty much all but said and done. But turn 1 Northshire Cleric certainly helps him find the tools to do this, as well as stifle some of Surrender's early pressure. So check number 1 might be successful.
Well, the Northshire Cleric does introduce a very funny dynamic with Glacial Shard of how you can play a little bit off the curve what you normally want to do with Kelseth and the Vicious Fledgling. Instead, answer your opponent's ability to draw cards, which is kind of the foundation of what Control Priest needs. But the more cards that they have, the better tools they can use to remove. And ultimately, Surrender is the one favored in this position. So if he lets Priest play into one of their 2 win conditions, which is draw to the cards, it could end up being disastrous.
Yep.
Regardless, goes for the coin Kelseth, because Kelseth still has one of the highest on-curve play win rates in Hearthstone right now.
It also just helps him contest this Northshire Cleric. I mean, he's going to lose the Keleseth in this spot, but the benefit that he gets is that it means that StrikeRight's not drawing a ton more cards. And that's a really big problem is when Northshire Cleric is able to pick up more than 1 additional card. The 1 hurts, but 2 of them feels really miserable because you still have to take it out at some point down the road. So for Surrender, I'd say the early game didn't go ideal for him, but Keleseth is certainly a nice substitute for that.
Acolyte of Pain going to continue to pick up the momentum for card draws, and with the Dustbreaker, should be able to answer most of the board, along with Wild Pyromancer. And from this position, Surrender would just love to play the Vicious Fledgling. Then he's at the mercy of whatever StrikeRight does afterwards.
Yeah, not really much, I think, to be said about that. You know, as far as this matchup is concerned from here, it is mostly a threat check game for Surrender. It's efficiently pacing out his cards and partitioning resources properly. We've seen throughout his career, though, that is one of the marks that makes him one of the world's elite, is that he continues to do that nigh flawlessly across his matches. The fact that StrikeRight here is risking this Vicious Fledgling connecting, I think is quite risky, and Surrender draws another 4/4 Vicious Fledgling to back this up. So if this gets some sort of defensive benefit like plus health or Divine Shield, that could be disaster for StrikeRight. He's gonna have to settle for stealth. And honestly, this is now setting up a really dangerous turn for Surrender, where Duskbreaker can blow him out of the water sometimes, or maybe he commits just a little bit less than that and is able to make something else happen. But these were not the ideal situations he was looking for. He either wanted plus health, or he wanted Divine Shield or Wind Fury or what have you.
If your opponent doesn't have the Dustbreaker, since you can't really play around it, then in terms of the raw stats, +3 attack seems to be the best case to force your opponent to remove it with whatever they can. And also, Dustbreaker on like 1 or 2 minions is not exactly what Dustbreaker usually wants to do. They want to catch like 3+ minions, which is very easy to do in this matchup.
Yeah, and this is the kind of play I mean by partitioning resources. You know, Surrender had a very interesting opportunity to go with the second Vicious Fledgling, a Glacial Shard here to freeze out the Twilight Drake and try to follow up strong afterwards. The problem with that is when StrikeRight has Duskbreaker, his position just looks awful afterwards. Rather than try to seize the game right now, Surrender is feeling like that he can just extend this a little bit more and look for a bigger punish down the road. I think a lot of that comfort comes from the Spiteful Summoner in this spot, but this is an example of how aggression timing really matters when you're playing these mid-range decks.
Yes.
There is probably 6 to 7 viable ways to play this turn, and instead Surrender's looking to continue to pace that game in another spot.
Well, what's important to remember is that this Spiteful Druid doesn't have to always just curve out the way you traditionally want to. You do have a lot of ability to play late into the game, as we saw with even Surrender series earlier today. Oh, wow.
See,
Power
now,
shield off the top.
And look at Surrender's reactions too, where he kind of sinks a little bit and goes, "Wow, maybe I should just try to fight that Twilight Drake straight up and actually kill the Acolyte of Pain here." There's certainly something that's on his mind, and akin to the Northshire Cleric, StrikeRight's on a lot of cards now. The game just got way harder for Surrender.
It's harder, but not it's not decided just yet, considering that Spiteful Summoner is also in the hand for Surrender. So what's the best way that we can set up for it? And it might just be simply trading onto the board and trying to make sure to maximize Spiteful Summoner's threat at this point.
Yeah, taking a look at who Surrender's faced so far: Mage, Kribo, Jinsu, Ashura. There's some good names in here. You know, Jinsu.
He's 5-1.
He's 5-1 right now, and he also had a big splash at the Wild International event that took place a couple months back, and he actually qualified for HCT during that Wild event. He played the tournament in between the 2 days
Wow.
of the Wild tournament and had won.
And then, of course, we know how great players like Mage and Karibo are. We've seen them do really well in playoffs before, even Mage going to the Spring Championship. For StrikeRight, he has also qualified for multiple playoffs. This would, I think, be his 3rd playoffs. And he's a pretty consistent player, always landing within the top 50 on the Legend ladder. So even though hasn't made a ton of waves in some of these HCT events, you know, if you keep showing up to the playoffs, eventually you can have that deep run that shows your consistency is paying off.
Yep. Take a look at StrikeRight's road as well. Nukusaku, good one in there.
That's a
Al
big
Kaiser.
win. Yeah.
Duck Malza was doing pretty well yesterday.
Role was, or Roll, I'm not sure if the E is pronounced there, but he was also another player that I was thinking about picking for one to watch. I guess good thing I did, because at least I would have gotten 0 points off of that, I believe. But you know, all things considering that APAC is just increasing its level of difficulty as a region in general. Speaking of difficulty, this turn from StrikeRight is kind of hard to deal with. Skillbane just has a 6/6, is threatening its own right, but if you use Shadow Word Death in this position, then you lose your ability to answer Spiteful Summoner, which is very clearly what Surrender wants to prioritize at this point.
And thinking into the game plans here from Surrender, he clearly has the priority of getting his strong minions down prior to Shadow Reaper Anduin, and trying his best to force out a Psychic Scream almost instantly. And so seeing the Shadow Word Death, it's important for Surrender to note that there still is one additional copy left for StrikeRight, but this partially clears the way for Spiteful Summoner.
Wow.
And that's really his intention, I think, with that turn.
Look at Surrender's face. The lone copy of Shadow Word Death has been used, so now it gets down to Psychic Scream to deal with this board in one fell swoop.
Surrender, his face just, he always has like
Sword?
a seeming amount of discomfort in these moments, you know. I was looking at his Twitter yesterday, and he was tweeting out pictures of him drawing both Ultimate Infestations with a Spiteful Summoner and a Grand Architect, and just these really terrible looking spots for him.
But this is still a pretty good response here from StrikeRight. He's just drawing a lot of cards. And, I mean, if you're given that ability to draw a lot of cards, get Shadow Reaper Anduin, Alex Straza, you can even just flip the aggression back onto Spiteful Druid.
This is a lot of cards that StrikeRight's able to draw, and this is the nightmare scenario for Surrender's deck, I think, and just him in this position in general. Is when StrikeRight draws this many cards, he's going to have a lot of answers.
This Acolyte has survived since it's played on turn 3.
Yeah.
It's been drawing a lot of cards, constantly being healed, and without this 5th draw from the Acolyte, StrikeRight would just be drawing that Divine Hymn or Skulking Guide equivalent. It's obviously a lot of cards have moved and he's used it off the top since, but just to kind of give a frame of reference of how big of a deal that Priest is that many cards deeper in the deck compared to having a Twilight Drake fighting on the board and picking up trades that Surrender may have to Glacial Shard, which wouldn't set up as clean of a Spiteful Summoner.
Yep, and with 10 in hand, StrikeRight's just going to burn one of the Divine Hymns here and say, yeah, I don't really need the healing. I think I got this one under control. And I'll tell you what, from Surrender's perspective, that is a disastrous looking turn for you, because your opponent's willing to just waste a healing spell effectively.
Yes.
So that they don't burn a card. And when you have this pressure on board, you know, sure, it's a big connection, but again, just it's the card advantage from StrikeRight. The fact that he's just got so many.
One thing I do want to call to attention, though, is the fact that Surrender's minions being buffed by the Prince Kel'Seth will make a lot of math complicated for StrikeRight, because things like the Dustbreaker aren't as clean kills on the Vicious Fledgling, and the Primordial Drake doesn't deal with like the first half body of the Firefly. So those allow minions for Surrender to pick up really good trades and could potentially just outvalue his opponent based off this one Ultimate Infestation that's in the hand, because StrikeRight doesn't actually have real proactive plays outside of his 2 dragons that, you know, well, actually, I guess if you count Dustbreaker as tempo, but it's not really. And a Skulking Guy, so it's just such bad stats for 6 mana.
Yep. Surrender just trying to set up quite literally as strong as a board as he can so that he can push through. I think the Spellbreaker gives him some much needed push potential against like a Primordial Drake, but this is looking like it will be a Psychic Scream turn for StrikeRight. You know, you're pretty happy to shuffle an Ultrasaur into your opponent's deck.
Yeah.
And kind of go from there. The only draw I think that might change that is Shadow Reaper Anduin.
Shadow Reaper Anduin is still scary in its own right, because you're leaving up a 4/4 Fledgling onto the board, but StrikeRight does pick up another way to potentially deal with the board with the Mass Dispel. Does have that plus the Dustbreaker to deal with everything but the Ultrasaur, because it's very clear that Ultrasaur won't be killed unless you Psychic Scream, and if you want to hold on to this AoE, then that's an alternative. However, I do think Psychic Screaming things like Glacial Shard and a Firefly and an Ultra Sword are pretty powerful, considering that your opponent doesn't really want to be drawing into those in the late stages of the game, even if they have ultimate infestation.
Yeah, the one thing I'm looking at right now for Surrender's, maybe a big long-term macro consideration is the number of cards left in StrikeRight stack. There is a chance that StrikeRight does not have Shadow Reaper Anduin until the very end turns of this. If that's the case, maybe there's a scenario where Surrender finds Malfurion and is able to sustain his life for long enough afterwards. I think that's a very big if, but it's not an impossibility, and Leroy is probably a draw that changes the way that he's going to look at that as well. 7-power Leroy, you're typically then thinking, how do I get my opponent into range of that? And his hand this turn is about as weak as it gets. Situational card that he doesn't necessarily want to play by itself, and then a couple of 1 and 2 power minions. This is about as bad as, you might even see a Leroy this turn. I don't think that's an impossibility.
Yeah, Leroy is a 7/3, so doesn't actually die too easily on the board, but it does die to a single lone copy of like a minion trade, those primordial trade. So it's not even about the Dustbreaker at that point. Your opponent just puts a big fat minion.
Surrender knows that pretty much no matter what he plays, it's going to get checked by StrikeRight. And so he has to find a way to just disrupt that. And for him, I think it just means pushing damage and hopefully StrikeRight stumbles with him.
Well, what's nice about this Leroy, and something that we shouldn't ignore, is that StrikeRight did use things like Divine Hymn pretty liberally. So health count of pressuring your opponent might matter if, say, Leroy hits face and then Ultimate Infestation hits face and then the second Ultimate Infestation hits face. You're getting close to killing your opponent, and that puts them in a weird position where they don't feel comfortable Shadow Reaper Anduing if they can't kill enough of the board and might just take too much damage on the crackback. Yep. We'll see. Right now, all things are pointing towards StrikeRight being a commanding position. One thing that is a very subtle but really impactful thing is Surrender has no greedy sprites to ramp up, and so he's had back-to-back turns where it's just very weak. And
just in time.
For people who don't know what Greedy Sprite is, they just, they want to very generously show you what Greedy Sprite is. 3 mana, 3/1 that ramps based off the Death Rattle. But yeah, at this point, what do you aim for as Surrender? You're just going to play the Spellbreaker, try to fight for board tempo, and then hope that Ultimate Infestation can carry you home.
Yep. One of the big breakpoints for StrikeRight too is when he's able to actually make a strong minion connection to Surrender's face. Oh boy. And there you go. Being able to make that minion connection is a lot of times the way that the damage in the deck is supplemented. It spends such an enormous amount of time playing defense that you sometimes don't have the damage at the end of the game. You include cards like Mind Blast and a Holy Fire to really make up that difference. So the fact that he's not only clearing out Surrender's board here, but he's also making a minion connection with a big minion on board that Surrender can't contest. This is about as over as it gets, I'd say, from Surrender's perspective. He's got some hope because he's got Ultimate Infestation, but looking at StrikeRight's hand, this is checkmate, I think.
Looking for any possibility for Surrender to fight back in this position. Death Knight is a really powerful tool to offset the damage from Shadow Reaper Anduin. The Lich King is also really powerful. These are all great, just was it too slow? Did StrikeRight draw too many cards, which is, at this point, it's very easy to say, yeah, he drew way too many cards. Look at the draw discrepancy. The fact Surrender just played Ultimate Infestation, which, by the way, is, in terms of the power level of 10-mana cards, probably as high as it gets.
Yeah.
And he's still 8 cards behind.
Now, he did have 4
He just drew 5.
He did have 4 minions shuffled back into his deck as well.
Yeah.
But, that's part of the way that the matchup operates. If StrikeRight's able to dig this deep, he's going to find the right cards.
Yeah.
I am shocked, actually, that he's not playing Shadow Reaper Anduin in this spot. I'm very surprised by this.
What is he scared about?
I don't know. Honestly, you play Shadow Reaper Anduin, you put some damage on Surrender, and you have Duskbreaker, Mass Dispel, the Squashling, Mind Blast. He's got everything to follow up.
Perhaps he's scared of being able to deal with, say, a Lich King or buffed minions from whatever he drawn, because things like Fungal Man sort of set up a pretty strong board.
We have seen a lot of that fear, and if he's playing it this way, I pretty much expect him to kill this 5/5 in this spot, if that's the case.
What if he's just trying to set up a big board for things like Mass Dispel to get big damage?
It's a good question, but there are some things that can change this, and I'm looking specifically at the Mind Control tech in Surrender's deck. It's a long shot, but if he steals a Primordial Drake, maybe he's got a shred of hope here.
I've seen bigger or less probable things happen.
And that probably is going to see. And this is still a very strong turn for StrikeRight. There's not really anything in Surrender's deck that contest a wide board like this. You're looking at Malfurion making some taunts, hopefully, Serenite Chain Gang, and then again, Mind Control tech for a big steal. But outside of that, there's not really much Surrender does to just fight a bunch of 2-1s.
Yeah, you're right about that. They definitely struggle on the AoE front. Malfurion plus, what, the removal onto the board, that gives you just enough to play Firefly or a Glacial Shard. That still feels really weak. Crypt Lord and the Serenite Chain Gang does put up a decent amount of resistance to your opponent, and you can keep buffing up that Crypt Lord to challenge the 2-1s. But if your opponent has Mass Dispel, everything that you set up for will basically be fruitless at that point. Looks like Surrender has felt that he can't really take the, he can't really play around this Mass Dispel at this point. He needs to assume his opponent has not drawn it yet out of the 7 remaining cards and try to fight back on the board like this.
I think it's a very reasonable hope as well. Just the Mass Dispel is, again, that looking back to that checkmate style scenario, it's just so hard. And Surrender, it looks like he elects not to attack at the last moment.
Yeah.
And with, an embarrassment of riches for StrikeRight at this point. Play what you want. He's pretty much got it.
StrikeRight has a very nice Dustbreaker clear at this point as well.
Yeah, doesn't even necessarily need to clear. I mean, the Crypt Lord's representing nothing on this board, really.
It's just you want to disallow any ability for your opponent to leverage the board like Fungal Mancer.
I mean, it's tough to win if a Primordial Drake's just sitting on board every single turn.
Yeah, smacking for 4. Surrender, I'm trying to think if there's some really elaborate out here. It's like Surrender hits Grand Archivist and the second Ultimate Infestation directly on this 4/7. But I don't know if that's even enough, because then he still has to take 4 and he's sitting at, there's also a bad case scenario of him hitting his own face and not gaining his life.
Something to note is that Surrender did see a natural Mass Dispel in that instance. He knows that taunts at this point do pretty much just protect him. Yeah. The Malfurion armor up plan, I think, is still quite likely to fail, but StrikeRight is going to have to operate with the natural damage left because both Shadow Visions are gone. So we're looking at the 2 copies of Mind Blast. We're looking at the Holy Fire that's there. You're looking at Anduin effects. And
so you're just thinking maybe out-heal it?
And is there a chance that happens? I don't really know. I mean, he's got 8 coming this turn from Malfurion. He would get 3 more on the next turn. And he's at the life total where Alex Straza just doesn't affect him even. So
he's going for it.
He's going for the Archivist.
And I like it. 3 out of these 5 targets are good. At this stage, I'll take those odds. However, it will get answered by Shadow Reaper Anduin guaranteed, and here's like another hidden weakness, or downside rather, of the Kel'Thuzad buff, is that it actually puts it within range of Shadow Reaper Anduin. And now the board won't even be addressed. At least Surrender didn't lose that life buff, because that's going to be really important. But from this stage, it feels like it has all but determined how on earth are you going to be able to survive this damage.
And it's really tough to do. There's just so much left for StrikeRight, even though a lot of his resources were quite forced. It's that minion damage over and over again. That's really the turning point for Control Priest. If you're able to connect to your opponent safely, that is the sign that your opponent has been defeated, basically.
Yeah, this is a huge win for the Control Priest, assuming that there's no way out for Surrender. He's trying to scour his brain for any lines. What can the Lich King perhaps grab me? Is there a way I can stall with Malfurion long enough? He does have a lot of decent stats, so it seems like if you play Malfurion and hide behind these minions, perhaps there's a way to shut off minion damage. Your opponent has to only hit you with spells like Mind Blast. But right now, he's still even flirting with Disaster because there's 16 damage with double Mind Blast, and he's at 17.
Yeah, and that's really the thing that's so important about the Malfurion development. At a certain stage, Surrender really needed to have this armor cranking out, but he was under pressure, didn't have that liberty, and now the Holy Fire drawn, and I believe that's just a two-turn, wrap this up and go to game 2, because this is 16 coming this turn with 9 more available in the following. So that's 25 damage in the face of Surrender having, 18 here, and then
he only had
points next turn.
Yeah, he had 20 life. Yeah, there's just no mathematical way unless He had some heal,
Yeah,
but
there's nothing left.
he didn't play the Lich King, so he can't get, he doesn't have access to that.
And he pretty much knows it. You know, Surrender's going to play this out as though Mind Blast is the absolute last card in StrikeRight's deck and try to find a way out. But even if that's the case, you know, he's got to deal 35 in the meantime. The big one to look at still is that Twilight Drake turn. Acolyte of Pain on board, opposing Twilight Drake. Surrender had the Vicious Fledgling and 4 mana. If that Spellbreaker had hit the Acolyte of Pain, he would have lost a lot of board pressure instead. But it would have taken a lot of card draw away from StrikeRight.
Exactly.
Maybe the early mid stage is really where Surrender can make one of those board sacrifices and try to pick it up later on. It's a lot more difficult for StrikeRight to use a Psychic Scream if he's just got his own good minions on board. But then Surrender will take a lot more damage in the meantime. It's like a really weird dance that Surrender has to just choose one of the paths, and whichever one he chooses, you know, it's too late to turn back at that point.
Certainly, and we know we can all understand that this is basically an easy victory for the Priest. Once they draw cards, StrikeRight was never in real danger whatsoever and ended the game at basically a perfect life count at 35, and that's going to wrap up game number 1. StrikeRight takes a huge upset, as this is one of the more lopsided matchups when Quest Rogue gets taken out of the equation. Spiteful Druid is supposed to run all over Control Priest. In this case, Control Priest was able to take a 30-70 matchup. What do you think about that?
Well, it's definitely at an advantage if it has all the right checks going for it. Again, Kaliseth got checked, Spiteful got checked. When those two are the case, big advantage to Priest at that point. So, you know, that's the thing about the unfavorable matchups, is that when you get the right tools, it looks like it's completely the other way around. It's very lopsided one way or the other, depending on those inflection points. So while Surrender may be at advantage in this one, you know, overall, it's one game that counts when you're here at the playoffs here. And that's why that game is such a critical win for StrikeRight here. I think now he's been a big favorite to win the set.
Yep. So that's going to be a 1-0 lead here for StrikeRight, and we'll find out what happens between this matchup between two Korean players in round 7 Swiss of the APAC Summer Playoffs. Two Koreans are battling out here in round 7 Swiss. StrikeRight, who is literally looking to follow his username, against Surrender, who's also trying to impose his username. Who is going to buckle first in this best of 5? Now, StrikeRight is not bringing an even Paladin deck. He is one of, I believe, 3 players not bringing it to this entire tournament.
96% of the field opted for even Paladin as part of their lineup. That actually might be the most representation I think we've seen from a deck.
No, we have a Jade Druid. Had 100% representation.
Oh, yeah, that was said.
Those were dark times. I remember when Jade Druid was so ambitious, but it was in Asia-Pacific when Hyoni tried to create an anti-Jade Druid lineup and almost succeeded. He played like Quest Mage and all these crazy meme decks, and somehow almost qualify for top 8.
I recall that now because what I remember is that Jade Druid is on so many auto ban style of lineups. It was difficult to build a lineup that didn't ban Jade Druid, honestly.
Right.
In this field, though, we've seen a number of players try to build decks that are just trying to beat even Paladin. I've seen it gone unbanned a number of times. And I think that's really one of the big differences, is that while even Paladin has this crazy representation, it's that it's just very strong. It's not an unbeatable deck, and there's a lot of ways to check it. But it's just got a lot of ways to sneak in wins as well. It's got plenty of cards that can just punish your opponent if they miss a beat. And for Surrender, definitely is the case. He's actually trimmed out like a copy of Serenite Chain Gang, for instance, and he's added in a copy of Glass Knight. He is running 2 copies of Argent Commander, and he does not have a Lich King in his top end, so there's no big threat that can get stuck in his hand. The real thing for me in this matchup is that StrikeRight has made some really interesting choices with his Spiteful Druid. You know, there's not a lot of flexible slots in this deck. He's opted for 2 Mind Control techs, the copy of Gluttonous Ooze, but he's only got 1 Crypt Lord, and one of the big things he put in here was a copy of Mossy Horror.
Yeah, he's not banning Paladin, so he knows that he has to go up against the Paladins.
Yeah, it's a really kind of a weird card. It's a 6 mana 2/7 that destroys all 2 power or less minions.
Friendly or foe.
Yeah, but that can be a very big tool at the right time. You know, thinking about against Serenite Chain Gang or a timely call to arms, that's a tool that can absolutely give him back to board.
Yep. So now kind of checking back into this game, since we talked about deck lists, StrikeRight has successfully ramped, which gives him 1 turn closer to this double Spiteful Summoner. And again, even Paladin is very strongly favored against the Spiteful Druid on paper.
I want to
But we'll find out if these tech choices from Strike will pay off.
I want to note the Serenite Chain Gang prior to Call to Arms here. This is a play that took me a long time to learn with even Paladin, is that when you're playing against a deck that wants to pressure you back by utilizing board, it's often very wise to get down a taunt instead and have Knife Juggler be protected in the face of the opposing minions. In this spot, StrikeRight is only going to have 1 option to take care of a Knife Juggler, and that would be exactly charging Druid of the Claw. That kind of pressure, I think, is immense for Surrender in this case, and he's actually going to shut off that option with the way that he trades.
Double Jugs.
Double Juggler, and this is something really scary. You know, even Paladin, one of the reasons I think it's so favored in this matchup is that it doesn't suffer nearly as much from the Spiteful Summoner impact as most decks do. The timing of not only the Call to Arms going directly into StrikeRight's 6 mana turn, but also the fact that he's got it protected compounds this issue so much for StrikeRight.
Well, if you look at the board state, it's great that his opponent has a 12/12 and all, but it only can attack once per turn.
Oh my gosh.
Quality off the top as well.
And this is another point I heard Jay Billy B talking about yesterday. A lot of players are always tempted to rip that equality right now and eliminate this board state. But Surrender is so far ahead that he has options for how he wants to do this. If he can save an equality for an Avenging Wrath turn and push an immense amount of damage, that's good for him. If he's able to just simply get Valinir online and say, you know what, it honestly doesn't really matter that much if I take 12 or 16 points of damage, I can just race, that's also an option for him. The fact that he's got so much damage gives him the liberty to do this, and this was all about his Call to Arms timing.
He's got 15 damage right now. If he just jams Valinir all aggressive. But of course, killing Spiteful Summoner will probably be important as well to protect some of his juggler action, because that makes equality even better, and then you have Consecration and Avenging Wrath to back those up like you were mentioning.
He's got every option available to him, and that's another point where if you have a lot of good options, you are winning by a lot. It's when you have one good option and then a lot of bad options that oftentimes you find yourself needing to take risks instead.
I don't hate the equality either. Most of his minions are very weak, and again, it's not like Spiteful Druid has very plentiful ways to address a wide board.
That might have wrapped it up. Honestly, just, you know, close his eyes, click some buttons. As long as he gets something done, it's going to be a good turn for him. Maybe Call to Arms at 5 mana is going to be a great change because you no longer have Gen Greymane to go with it.
It's going to be a big change, that's for sure. Odd Paladins will include it. Murloc Paladins will be a little bit slower. And it's nowhere near as impressive as it is in Odd Paladin as it is in Even.
Yep. And
But the jury's still out on that one.
When you look at Surrender's lineup, honestly, Spiteful Druid looks like a soft target for him. I think that his Spiteful deck is a little bit attuned for the mirror. The fact that he's got Leroy Jenkins for some burst damage, a tool that's often lost in that matchup. The fact that he is trimmed down one of the mind control techs and that he's moving heavy on Vicious Fledgling is going to command a lot of attention from your opponent. Quest Rogue, just a strong deck in general. It's been banned away from him at this point. And then he's got Cube Warlock, which I think always has the potential to race back against a Spiteful deck in that situation. Scoops it up.
StrikeRight can't find any way out because Druid the Claw and the hero power is his best defensive maneuver, and his opponent has so many ways to kill just from the board state alone because of double Knife Juggler that's just allowed to stick onto the board. And that is why even Paladin is so strong, because Spiteful Druid can't fight back once it loses the board, and from turn 1 it loses the board.
Yeah, and that's the centerpiece, I think, of most of Surrender's decks. If he's not taking the board, he has plenty of ways to fight the board. And that one particular deck for StrikeRight, I think, is going to be a bit of a problem, And again, looking at the tech choices, he never got a payoff with Mossy Horror. That was a card that could have potentially changed that game. And in his Rogue deck, he's got a copy of Acidic Swamp Ooze in Quest Rogue. That is a card that really provides very little unless you are like nailing a Skull of the Minari against Warlock.
Or, trying to stop Paladins from pressuring you too much, if they have a lot of weapons.
Which is already very difficult for Quest Rogue to do. So I am a bit concerned that maybe that even though the tech choices look quite brilliant in his lineup, that it could be a little bit overboard and make him suffer from some amount of inconsistency at times.
No, we'll see. I mean, Surrender gets a really big win, but granted, even Paladin was quite possibly his best deck in this entire head-to-head. And now we go to the Druid Rogue versus the Druid Warlock, which, Quest Rogue has a lot of good tools against Spiteful Druid and Cube Warlock. So I'm looking at StrikeRight to make some big plays with his Quest Rogue coming up here in game number 3.
Yep, and I've heard players on both sides of this say that they are favored. A lot of the Quest Rogue players that started in this season, one of the ones I talked to the most, I think, was Killin All Day about Quest Rogue. He's pretty much played that deck since its inception, and he gave me a lot of insight on how to play these matchups. I'd say the big card for StrikeRight in this matchup is that he's included Valera the Hollow in his list. And against Warlock decks that tend to play a longer game, that card provides you an immense amount of value. In my experience playing Quest Rogue, I did not include Valera, and I at times would gas out versus Warlock decks. StrikeRight's going to hang on to the Acidic Swamp Ooze in this matchup, and that is a pretty bold call, I think. I mean, he has included it for this matchup, but you think about its purpose, it is literally to kill Skull of the Minari, and then otherwise, it's like just another card that's mulligan for him. He already has to invest 1 into the quest, and now his 1 is invested in Acidic Swamp Ooze.
Yeah, but he managed to draw Novice Engineer on turn 1 and has Shadow Step as well, so has options available to him on how he wants to utilize his quest here. He does pick up Valera the Hollow as well, so he does have a plan to go for the long game. Mimic Pod off the top into more Mimic Pods.
Wow, and you see his
Is this
eyes.
the Tavern Brawl? Does he have preparation in his deck too? He does!
Did you see his eyes light up when he drew Mimic Pod? Like, that is a sight to behold for StrikeRight, because
well, now he can spend his mana.
It's not about him racing towards quest completion. It's about him fending. Oh my gosh, and Sonya gets
That is gross.
It's about building these massive turns that really punish Surrender for not having aggressive openers.
You can Shadow Step Sonya as well. Oh my gosh.
Surrender put a lot of his effort into getting a Mountain Giant online this game and trying to pressure StrikeRight out, which in hindsight, that looks like a fairly brilliant call because StrikeRight doesn't have a card that handles a Mountain Giant right now.
Right. The Mountain Giant here, which was a big keep for Surrender, was important.
And he honestly
was searching for other ways that he can pound into damage. So a second Mountain Giant, perhaps to face a Manipulator. He even threw away like a cube because he didn't have a Dark Pack, so he needs to combo these things.
And here's the thing, Surrender now, he's going to keep his eye on those 2 Mimic Pod slots right there. It's very important he pays particular attention to them. You can even see his eyes at the top of the screen. As soon as he sees one of those, he's going to know what 4 of the 8 cards in StrikeRight's hand are. The more of those cards he can eliminate, the less likely it is that StrikeRight has advantage. You may see Surrender play a Doomguard soon and just try to get the job done. I think that's a very real possibility for trying to close this game.
With 2 Doomguards, I'm going for it.
I don't know what Surrender's going to do, and you can see him kind of cover his face here.
He's got a lot of damage.
I feel like his instinct is telling him to play a Doomguard, and he's now going to think of every scenario possible to try to justify one way or the other.
Well, if they have Sonya, and you know that they have a copy of the Vicious Scale Hide.
Wow, that was quick. And discards 2 pretty fantastic cards to discard, I'd say. And now StrikeRight is honestly in trouble. I mean, Surrender has another Doomguard in hand, and that's 18 points of damage represented. This is one of the things that I always look for in Cube Warlock players, knowing when to just simply play Doomguard. It's a very difficult thing to do, but look at that ooze on the left side of StrikeRight's hand. He kept that to try to prevent these scenarios.
He has an ability to draw the Glacial Shards, though, and can pick up with more with the Elven Minstrel. The Wax Elemental is that exactly what he's looking for in the spot?
Well, it may be something that he's looking for, but Surrender has Spellbreaker in hand. So whether it be Wax Elemental or Glacial Shard, Surrender's got a way to push damage.
But then he stays alive just barely, and that gives him a turn to draw Preparation.
That's really what his goal is right now, is find a way to delay this and then accelerate either a quest completion or a vanish in some way. That's about it right now, though.
There once was a man from your neck.
And look at Surrender. Just
No shard. So he's at the mercy of a Defile lethal here. If Surrender picks up Defile, that is game.
It's not it. Yeah, no copies of Mortal Coil in Surrender's deck, so it was exactly Defile that got the job done, I believe.
But even still, like a Hellfire from this position is still really strong, although I wonder if Surrender feels comfortable leaving up more of the board and instead just developing more pressure. But then now Vanish becomes a real problem as well.
Well, if you're looking at Hellfire, I imagine Surrender's also looking at a life tap. And so now this helps him make a decision where, since he's got another Hellfire in hand, I think this pushes more damage overall, as well as doesn't take the risk of discarding some key cards. StrikeRight's down to 4, and I think this is a life total that Surrender really wants him to feel somewhat comfortable with and hope that he can't just pop off. And the fact that StrikeRight does not have a preparation is now punishing him. I don't think he gets out of this game.
Well, the big thing was that, even though StrikeRight may have felt like it was great to have Mimic Pod to use up his mana, he wasn't given time because of that Mountain Giant.
Yeah.
And now he's extremely dependent on this Wax Elemental to get in the way of his opponent, which is not going to happen, in my opinion, here.
Come, try your luck.
Yeah, he's got to just hope this works out.
Yeah, he's gonna trade into the Doomguard.
He's going to be up to 8 life at the end of this with a Wax Elemental down, and that's enough.
But just the Spellbreaker right here.
Yeah.
He's gonna just end the game.
It was a beautiful recognition on the Doomguard for Surrender. He was able to punish a greedy keep that stumbled.
Quest is completed, turn 7, but you see the limitation of the deck when it doesn't have things like the Glacial Shard in preparation, or even just the Vanish to stall for time. And Surrender is going to just be able to lob over this Wax Elemental. StrikeRight is devastated, as this was a matchup that he was supposed to win.
And
the unfavorables are just going the other way this series.
And honestly, this is not a way that I have typically seen the game played. I actually trying to recall seeing a Mountain Giant keep from a Cube Warlock player. I don't think I've actually seen that happen. Now, I know that I've had Mountain Giant and gone, wow, this is actually pretty good. But I've never actually thought to just keep it in that matchup and then slamming the Doomguard right on 5. That's another very atypical play. That was 2 things that I had not accounted for in that matchup that I think Surrender clearly had, as he kept Mountain Giant and very quickly played the Doomguard on turn 5.
That's right. How do we beat combo decks? We kill them before they can play the combos onto us. And I think Cube Warlock is no exception. They have Doomguard with charge. We're going upstairs, and that means a 2-1 lead for Surrender. What's going to happen in game number 4? Will Surrender close out the series, or will StrikeRight be able to make a comeback? We'll find out when we return to the Asia-Pacific Summer Playoffs. One more game is what all stands between Surrender and a chance at the top 8, or perhaps StrikeRight will strike back in game number 4 as Quest Rogue just lost to Cube Warlock. Now, granted, if you look at the numbers a little bit more compared to traditional feeling, even if you do say, yeah, Cube Warlock or Control Warlock are slower decks, Cube Warlock is much better at fighting against Quest Rogue because of that pressure. Spiteful Druid also is the case as well. People will look at Spiteful Druid decks and think about all the ways that Quest Rogue can just invalidate the minions by having 5/5s, but Spiteful Druid is also really good at pressuring, and you look at cards like Vicious Fledgling, for example, that goes unchecked, game is over. Or you get Spiteful Summoner, a 12/12 that you can't really interact with, also will just end the game right there. So this matchup is still really close, and Surrender, even though he's the underdog, is still overall looking pretty good in the series.
Yep, and you see him keep Vicious Fledgling in the hand. This is a card that often is, in terms of metagame choice, very hit or miss. When your opponent's ready to kill 3/3s, this is about one of the worst ones that's out there. When your opponent is not necessarily ready to kill 3/3s and instead is trying to fight on a different angle, Vicious Fledgling becomes a very terrifying card to face against. So for StrikeRight, very similar to his Priest matchup, rule number 1 is going to be check the early game. If he can get past Vicious Fledgling fairly safe, the next big goal for him is to be able to have a very timely vanish or be able to complete quest very fast and then have his 5/5s take over the rest of the game.
Oof. And here's a big thing for Surrender as well. After this Vicious Fledgling comes down, if it doesn't get checked, there's no way for StrikeRight to directly remove it if Surrender plays taunts in front of it, which could very easily set up Surrender to a position where if StrikeRight doesn't have the right tools, he's just going to take Vicious Fledgling damage, or would be in a position to play very liberally with his resources. Sometimes we've seen players prep Vanish very early against Spiteful Druid just due to the pressure.
Yeah, and so the other thing that Surrender's thinking about now is does Greedy Sprite create a similar style of pressure that Vicious Fledgling would? You know, Vicious Fledgling is a card that StrikeRight's going to want to take care of very fast, but Greedy Sprite's a card you oftentimes want to have your opponent trade with on their turn, rather than be able to answer it yourself and then have them accelerate some of their power plays. Going into a 5-mana turn is not as powerful for Surrender, so I think that he's slowly eliminating Greedy Sprite, but similar to the Call to Arms play that we saw, maybe he wants to play a taunt prior to Vicious Fledgling as well.
I think Vicious Fledgling is quite possibly the best play on turn 3 against Quest Rogue because it just forces an action against them. Crypt Lord is also a candidate as well, too, when you think about it. Okay, this is... So, the reason why is because turn 3 is actually a hidden power turn for Quest Rogue. They can not only see, as the play you see right here, Coin Elven Minstrel, but also they can Mimic Pod, they can turn Shadow Step, they, you know, sometimes just have a 1-drop and Redagger. And so this is pretty interesting that Surrender is putting a lot of emphasis, and he's rewarded with a Spiteful Summoner pickup because he developed that Greedy Sprite. So he knows that if StrikeRight develops any minion like Coin Elven Minstrel, in the event that he gets Spiteful Summoner in the next 2 draws, he would be heavily rewarded.
Oh my. Oh my.
2 Sonias. How is that insanely good, or is that just?
It's just that it's Sonya in general.
Okay.
Like,
I mean, the fact that he has it in his hand is probably the biggest.
Yeah. So the other thing too is that Surrender, he does have Spiteful Summoner, but StrikeRight has got Glacial Shard, and he's also got Zola in this spot as well. So being able to, you know, potentially have a lot of Glacial Shards start to lock this board down is going to be a big one. And you see StrikeRight's reaction, it's much more just because that is a 12/12 than it is that he can't target it. None of these spells in his deck are going to target that anyway. It's all minion stuff. So he's going to look to try to freeze this out of the game until he can complete a quest. But that is still pretty tough when Surrender's just piling on damage turn after turn.
However,
you also have to consider the spell breakers in Surrender's deck. He's got 2 copies. Anytime he draws that represents 12 points of damage connecting.
that was something I was going to bring up as well. And I was also kind of looking at Surrender's situation where he had the ability to leverage his board too with Fungal Mancer. So it's not even necessarily the end of the world, because he still pushes 6 and threatens to kill next turn with the Fungal Mancer play.
One of the big questions to me is, once he sees a Glacial Shard and a Zola and he sees them copied, how much attention does he want to put into simply clearing off the board? Sonya landing on either of these minions is pretty much lights out, and a charge minion, I think, is maybe the way that he can get some footing in this game. So killing this Zola, I think, is very paramount for him.
Huge. Because
it's also into the Vanish turn. So I think this is a turn where it's a really big road hump for Surrender, and that maybe gives StrikeRight some time.
Yep, there's no Shadow Step, for example, to really benefit off of that. And look what StrikeRight has to do. He has to utilizes Sonya and the boar, and then freeze the 12-12, and then just pray that this vicious fledgling doesn't get out of control. Because without that Vanish, he's basically hoping that he can finish the quest with what he's got.
And if Surrender did not catch where that Sonya came from, he doesn't know that there's a second copy in StrikeRight's hand. So, you know, if he had just glanced away for a moment and lost track of where the cards were in StrikeRight's hand, that could come as a surprise to him.
That being said, Fungal Mancer is really insane on a Vicious Fledgling that's able to land a Wind Fury Adapt, and that would put Surrender on a 2-turn lethal, which forces StrikeRight to immediately vanish, and he doesn't have enough mana to finish the quest unless he has Preparation. So that's forcing your opponent to have specifically 2 cards in combination, and you can eliminate 2 of those cards with Sonya Sand Dancer and Stone Tusk 4.
The other thing, too, is that he pretty much knows that there is no Vanish in StrikeRight's hand. And look at Surrender's face to these adapt options. None of these adapt options really do anything except the stealth. The stealth can protect him from getting frozen or from it getting run into by a 5/5.
That's right. So Shrouding Mist, definitely the most powerful option here. There's no sap or anything in the deck list as far as I see. And even then, I mean, he's still threatening lethal. So StrikeRight picks up Shadow Step. So Shadow Step.
He's at 2 of 5 on quest right now?
Yes. So Stone Tusk Boar is not enough just to finish here.
Look at Surrender as he continue. I don't know if that's a look of relief that he's spending 2 mana on a Novice Engineer.
Yes. Well, more importantly, he's praying that StrikeRight doesn't have some kind of preparation Vanish, because the first thing that you think about is just Vanish straight up. Do I have to lose all of the tempo that I set up here?
And I think that's a very welcome sight for Surrender, is now he knows that StrikeRight's digging for something specifically. Honestly, I don't think it's there.
He needs another Glacial Shard.
Oh!
So now he has Wax Elemental to stay alive, is that it?
That is not good.
I think he might have to Mimic Pot, Hail Mary, and get 2 Glacial Shards.
And he doesn't.
No, he's dead.
StrikeRight, pressured out, does not have the tools to follow up, and Surrender is gonna cleanly take 3 straight games?
Yeah, it was a game 1 victory for StrikeRight, and then Surrender was able to return serve very much over and then break it and close out the series 3-1 off the back of 2 unfavored matchups against Quest Rogue. And do want to call to attention as well that StrikeRight also had a lot of agency in those games. Even though it seemed like there was a lot of inevitable setup for the mid stages, how he lays the foundation for his hand is what ultimately defines the Quest Rogue's options mid game. If they're drawing a lot early on because they recognize that they need more tools, or if they just want to get greedy and use the quest immediately, you do have to kind of wonder about things like, was the Mimic Pod on the Sonya Sand Dancer what he's actually looking for? Because he just needed way more time. And Spiteful Druid is not a deck that gives you a lot of time. If they hit Spiteful Summoner or even just a Cobalt Scalebane, you're not given much room to breathe at that point. You have to vanish or freeze repeatedly.
I'm also looking at the turn 2 dagger up, for instance. He has a Vicious Scalehide in hand. Is that a matchup where he can ever just develop the board and have something try to poke away a little bit instead? The difference on the Spiteful Summoner being an 8/8, a 7/14, or 12/12 made no difference in that game where the pressure race was concerned. So, the Spiteful is just the fact that it's a Spiteful Summoner, a very large minion. I have to agree with you in terms of player agency. I think he had a lot of different decisions he could make, even looking at Game 2 versus Warlock, where he kept the Ooze. Ooze did nothing in that match.
Yeah, that's something. I mean, should Ooze even be in the deck, first of all? That's definitely a question to call. But at the same time, round 7 feature match is over, so we're just going to put that one in the history book. Surrender improves to 5-2, and we'll welcome another pair. You might call him the Spiteful Caster and his 12/12 buddy. It's TJ and Sotto.
I'm the 12/12, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.